My name is Harlan Vance. For 14 years, I worked as an independent mine safety auditor throughout southern West Virginia. If you spend enough time 400 feet underground in McDowell County, you learn that coal shafts don't just hold stone and timber. They hold memories that the earth never intended to give back. In the autumn of 3 years ago, I was contracted by a regional land trust to audit a pre-1930s anthracite shaft near an abandoned patch town called Coalwood. My job was simple: descend the haulage slope, assess the timber shoring, verify ventilation, and clear the site for sealed capping. Before I went down, the land trust representative handed me a brittle, leather-bound company ledger from 1928. Most of it was routine tonnage logs, but a handwritten note in the margin of the final page caught my eye. A shift foreman had logged a dispute with a cutter named Thomas Vance, no relation to me, as far as I knew. Thomas had refused to work the lowest face alone, swearing on his life that whenever he raised his lantern, an extra shadow was swinging a pick right beside his own. 2 days after that report was logged, Thomas vanished inside Shaft 4. They found his brass badge and leather boots sitting by the tracks, but no body. Reading that in the autumn daylight outside the portal, I brushed it off as classic methane-induced delirium. The air inside Shaft 4 was ice-cold and heavy with the wet, iron scent of damp slate and sulfur. My equipment consisted of a heavy steel hard hat with an LED headlamp, a 3,000-lumen handheld halogen spotlight, and a multi-gas monitor clipped to my chest strap. 400 yards down the main drift, the tunnel tapered until the ceiling dropped to under 5 feet. I had to hunch over, my boots crunching through 3 inches of stagnant black water running along the rusted remnants of the iron cart tracks. The silence was absolute, the kind of subterranean dead calm where you can hear the fluid moving in your own ears. I reached the face wall at the end of the drift, where the miners had abandoned the seam almost a century ago. It was a solid vertical wall of dense, rich anthracite. Anthracite is high-grade coal, jet black and glossy, but in a closed room, it usually swallows light like velvet. I set my halogen spotlight on an oak timber frame, aiming the broad beam straight at the black wall to take structural photos. The light was blindingly bright, throwing my shadow in crisp, dark detail against the coal face. I raised my camera to my eye. That was when I noticed the projection on the wall. Cast against the gloss of the anthracite wall was my shadow, the sharp outline of my hard hat, my pack, and my bent posture. But right next to my shadow, cast by the exact same light beam, was a second silhouette. It was taller than me, standing broad and stooped. The shadow wore a wide-brimmed canvas miner's cap, and hanging from its outstretched left hand was the distinct outline of an old-fashioned carbide lantern. My breath caught in my throat. The foreman's note from 1928 flashed in my mind. I lowered the camera and spun around instantly, sweeping my headlamp down the narrow tunnel behind me. The passage was empty. There was nothing between my halogen spotlight and the timber frame, just open air and swirling coal dust floating in the yellow beam. I turned back to the face wall. The second shadow was still there, clear as ink on paper, rooted right beside mine. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. I assumed it was an optical illusion, a strange diffraction caused by the angle of the light reflecting off the faceted coal surface. I stepped forward to wave my arm in front of the lens to break the shadow. My shadow's arm raised. The second shadow did not move. It remained perfectly still, its shadow hand gripping the outline of that hung lantern. Deciding to reset my eyes, I reached down and flicked the toggle switch on the halogen spotlight, plunging the face wall into pitch-black darkness. The moment the light died, the subterranean dead calm shattered. Right at my right ear, no more than 2 inches from my cheek, I heard a heavy, wet clink. It was the unmistakable sound of an iron hand pick striking deep into wet coal, accompanied by the low, wet sigh of a man exhaling through a choked throat. The air against my neck turned instantly freezing, smelling of stale grease and 80-year-old sweat. Panic surged through me like an electric shock. My hand trembled violently as I scrambled for the spotlight switch, flicking the bright halogen beam back on. The light burst across the anthracite wall. The second shadow hadn't vanished. It had moved. It was no longer standing beside my shadow. It had stepped forward. On the wall, the black silhouette of the miner was now standing directly behind my own shadow, its outline so close that the shadow of its chin hovered right over my shadow's right shoulder, and its right arm was raised. In the shadow's hand, raised high above my head, was the distinct, pointed shape of a heavy iron pickaxe. The terror hit me with brutal clarity. The entity wasn't moving in the dark. The darkness froze it in place. But the moment the light was struck, the moment the light rendered its outline against the coal, it gained ground, using the light itself as the bridge to cross over. Even as I stood paralyzed, watching the wall, the shadow on the coal face slowly began to lean downward. The silhouette of its left hand, the hand holding the carbide lantern, reached out on the wall until the drawn outline of its fingers touched the shadow of my own neck. A freezing, crushing weight slammed onto my actual, physical shoulder. It felt like a block of ice pressing down through my heavy duck canvas jacket, grinding into my collarbone. I didn't turn around to look. I didn't grab my camera or my halogen spotlight. I slapped my hand against my headlamp switch, killing every single photon of light in the tunnel. The mine went completely, terrifyingly dark. In the pitch black, the heavy clink of the pickaxe struck the floor again, this time right between my feet. I dropped to my hands and knees in the freezing, stagnant water. I closed my eyes tight, keeping my head down, and began crawling backward in total darkness. I refused to turn on my headlamp. I refused to strike a match or open my eyes. I guided myself entirely by touch, dragging my fingers along the slippery, cold iron of the rusted cart tracks, feeling the timber posts pass my shoulders one by one. Every few paces, in the pitch black, I could hear the wet, heavy footsteps sloshing through the water behind me, pausing whenever I paused, keeping pace with my frantic crawl. But as long as I kept the light off, it couldn't take that final step. It took me 45 agonizing minutes to crawl those 400 yards back to the mouth of the slope. When my hands finally touched the cold mud and fallen leaves near the portal, I threw myself out into the gray afternoon air of McDowell County and ran until I reached my truck. I resigned from mine auditing the following week. I moved away from the mountains, and I live in a flat city now. But to this day, I keep every light in my house turned off at night. People ask me why I prefer to sit in the dark. They don't understand that for me, the darkness is the only thing keeping the shadows from taking another step. My name is Warren Croft. For 11 years, I was a night shift road maintenance technician for the National Park Service, assigned to a 30-mile stretch of the Blue Ridge Parkway in western North Carolina. If you've ever driven those high-elevation ridges after sundown, you know how thin the atmosphere feels up there. But between milepost 335 and 345, a jagged, timber-choked pass known as Whistler's Notch, the mountains don't just feel high. They feel conscious. Whistler's Notch was blasted through a towering spine of exposed granite back during the parkway's construction in the mid-1930s. The cut left two sheer, 70-foot rock faces flanking a narrow two-lane road. Local mountain families in Yancey County had a name for that gap long before the road crew brought dynamite, the Cradle Gap. According to old handwritten logs kept at the ranger station, 19th-century livestock drovers noticed that whenever autumn gales blew off Mount Mitchell, the wind rushing through the natural fissures in the granite would pipe a slow, distinct four-note melody. It sounded like an unearthly woodwind organ, playing an old Scottish lullaby that mountain mothers used to hum to quiet restless infants. The drovers also left a warning in those logs, passed down through generations of mountain road crews. Never kill your engine while the gap is singing. It was the third week of November when I pulled my Ford F-350 utility truck into the notch. A late-season ice storm was moving across the ridge, coating the pavement in black slush and dropping heavy mountain laurel branches across the travel lanes. It was 2:15 a.m. The temperature was 27 degrees, and the mountain fog was so thick my yellow roof strobe bounced off a wall of white 5 feet in front of my bumper. I stopped the truck near the narrowest point of the rock cut to clear a fallen pine bough blocking the northbound lane. Once the wood was dragged to the shoulder, I climbed back into the heated cab, wet, exhausted, and shivering. Without thinking, purely out of muscle memory after a long 6-hour sweep, I turned the ignition key back to cut the diesel engine so I could drink my coffee in peace while updating my paper logbook. The sudden silence inside the cab was immediate and total. Then, the wind hit the granite walls. It started as a low, resonant whistle that vibrated straight through the floorboards of the truck. Within seconds, the wind picked up speed, rushing through the stone fissures above. Pitch by pitch, it locked into that famous 4-note melody. It was a hollow, haunting sound, notes stepping up, holding for 3 agonizing seconds, and then dropping into a mournful minor key. I smiled to myself, remembering the old stories. I reached over to turn my key back to auxiliary to kick on the cab heater. Nothing happened. The dashboard lights remained pitch black. The digital clock flickered once and died. I turned the key all the way to the starter. No click, no engine turnover, no sound at all. The voltage gauge needle on the dash dropped dead flat to 0, as if every amp of power in the heavy dual batteries had been instantly drained into the cold air. Panic began to seep into my chest. I grabbed my heavy Maglite flashlight from the passenger seat and clicked the switch. It didn't even flicker. The bulb was dead. Outside, the 4-note song through the rocks grew louder, vibrating the side windows in their rubber tracks. And then, the melody changed. The wind didn't play the slow Scottish lullaby anymore. The pitch bent violently, sliding into a frantic, familiar rhythm. It was a simple 4-bar melody that had no business being played by a mountain gap. It was the exact tune I had spent 20 minutes humming to my 6-year-old daughter, Clara, while tucking her into bed in Asheville just 5 hours earlier. A private, off-key song I had made up on the spot to help her sleep. The wind was piping my song. It hit the exact pitch cracks in my own voice, echoing off 70 feet of solid granite. Cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I sat frozen in the driver's seat, listening to the mountain whistle my own domestic, intimate memory into the freezing night air. Then came the sound from the truck bed. Directly behind my head, through the glass of the rear cab window, I heard a wet, heavy rustling, like hundreds of broad leaves being turned over by hand. I forced myself to look into the driver's side mirror. The heavy steel bed of my utility truck, which had been loaded with high-visibility traffic cones, iron chains, and bags of rock salt when I left the station, was overflowing. In the dim moonlight filtering through the fog, I saw hundreds of long, green branches heaped 3 feet high. They were dripping wet mountain laurel branches and massive white rhododendron blossoms, fully bloomed and glistening with warm spring dew, filling the bed to the brim. In the Appalachian Mountains, mountain laurel doesn't bloom in November, and a field of blooming laurel in the deep woods is what the old-timers call a laurel hell, a place where men walk in and never find their way out. A soft, familiar tap sounded against the rear glass of the cab. It sounded like small, wet knuckles knocking against the window pane. And right through the crack in the door seal, carried by the whistling wind, came a small, muffled voice, speaking in my daughter's exact voice, coming straight from underneath that pile of wet blossoms in the truck bed. Asterisk, Daddy, turn off the heater. It's cold out here. Asterisk. The blood drained from my face. Every instinct in my body yelled at me to turn around, to open the door, to look into the truck bed. But I remembered the drover's journals. The gap doesn't just whistle the wind. It harvests what you bring into it. It takes your fondest, most defensive memories, twists them into a lure, and waits for you to step outside the metal frame of your vehicle. I closed my eyes tight. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. "You're in Asheville," I whispered out loud, my teeth chattering uncontrollably. "You're in bed. You're in Asheville." I reached into my high-visibility coat pocket and pulled out a mechanical emergency highway flare. No batteries, No electronics, just a strike cap and magnesium wire. I twisted the cap and struck the flare against the top. A blinding, brilliant red light erupted inside the cab, filling the interior with thick, sulfurous smoke and intense heat. I shoved the burning flare directly against the glass of the driver's side window, bathing the side mirror in an aggressive, unnatural crimson glare. The moment the chemical fire lit up the granite walls, the wind melody shrieked. A high, deafening wail of torn metal that rattled the teeth in my jaw. The voice behind the rear glass let out a wet, gasping cough that sounded less like a child and more like wind blowing through an open pipe filled with water. I kept my eyes glued straight ahead at the foggy road, refusing to glance at the mirror or the rear glass, holding the burning flare high. For 10 agonizing seconds, the wailing wind fought the crimson light. Then, with a sudden, violent thud that rocked the entire 3-ton truck on its suspension, the wind dropped completely dead. The silence returned to Whistler's notch, stark, natural, and cold. On the dashboard, the digital clock suddenly lit up, 2:22 a.m. The gauge needles bounced back to life. Without hesitation, I turned the ignition key. The diesel engine roared to life on the first crank, its heavy rumble drowning out the night. I slammed the truck into drive and floored the accelerator, tearing out of the granite gap without ever looking back. I didn't stop until I hit the bright halogen lights of the district ranger headquarters in Burnsville. When the morning shift arrived, 2 young technicians looked into the bed of my truck and asked why I had hauled half a yard of crushed granite and rotten pine needles into the bay. There were no laurel blossoms, no rhododendrons, just cold mountain stone and dead dirt. I turned in my badge and truck keys that afternoon. I live in the flat coastal plains of eastern North Carolina now, far away from the ridges and the gaps. My house doesn't have high ceilings, and I keep storm shutters bolted over every window. But on quiet autumn evenings, when a coastal breeze passes through the screen door, I sometimes hear a faint, 4-note whistle in the air. And whenever my daughter sings in her room down the hall, I have to stand at her doorway and watch her lips move, just to make sure it's really her voice I'm hearing, and not the mountain calling me back. My name is Kalen Mercer. For 7 years, I worked as a senior land surveyor and boundary assessor for the Breathitt County Clerk's Office in eastern Kentucky. If you know anything about the topography of the Cumberland Plateau, you know that the maps don't tell the whole story. Between the steep limestone ridges are deep, narrow V-shaped valleys called hollers. Some of them are so tight and deep that the sun only reaches the gravel floor for 20 minutes at high noon. The old-timers call them bottom hollers, places where property lines haven't changed since the Revolutionary War land grants, and where the mountain seems to swallow whatever strays off the main county routes. In the spring of 2 years ago, I was tasked with resolving an unrecorded boundary dispute near an abandoned coal seam off Highway 15, deep in a valley known on original 1880s plat maps as Blackwood Holler. I drove my 4-wheel drive Chevy truck down the single-lane dirt track that led into the mouth of the holler. It was 3 in the afternoon, but the moment the gravel dropped below the ridge line, the ambient sunlight died. The canopy of towering hemlocks and white oaks met overhead, locking out the sky and plunging the road into a dense, cool green twilight. My cellular signal dropped to 0 within 50 yards. The track was barely 8 feet wide, wedged between a sheer, wet mud wall on my left and a 10-foot drop into a sluggish, black creek on my right. I was moving slow, maybe 15 miles an hour, watching my trip odometer to mark the distance from the highway. At exactly 1.2 miles into the holler, I passed utility pole number 12, a weathered wooden pole with a rusted copper ground wire hanging loose. 10 feet past the pole stood an old, rusted metal mailbox mounted on a rot-eaten locust post in front of a collapsed, moss-covered log cabin. I glanced down at my dashboard to log the mileage. The digital odometer read 114, 382.1. As my front tires crossed a shallow ridge of damp gravel past the mailbox, a violent static pop hummed through my truck speakers. The digital screen on my dash flickered, Right before my eyes, the numbers on the odometer didn't just stop, they began rolling backward. Asterisk 114, 382.1, 114,382.0, 114, 381.7, asterisk. The numbers spun down exactly 4/10 of a mile in 3 seconds. A dizzying wave of nausea hit my stomach, like the feeling you get on a roller coaster when your weight leaves the seat. The air pressure inside the cab plummeted, popping both of my ears with a sickening crack. I slammed on the brakes. My truck skidded to a halt in wet clay. I looked out my windshield, expecting to see the collapsed log cabin and utility pole number 12. They were gone. I was sitting back at the mouth of the holler, parked right beside the yellow wooden county maintenance sign off Highway 15. The highway asphalt was visible 20 yards behind my tailgate. I sat there with my hands glued to the steering wheel, my heart hammering against my ribs. I assumed I had suffered an absent seizure or a sudden spike in blood pressure. I checked my watch. No time had passed. I checked my trip log. The 4/10 of a mile I had just driven had been completely erased from the vehicle's computer. Shaking my head, I put the truck back in drive. I assumed my mind was playing tricks on me from exhaustion. I stepped on the gas and entered the holler a second time. The second run down the track was identical until I reached 1.2 miles. I passed utility pole number 12 again. But this time, as I looked out my side window, the holler had visibly changed. The road was narrower. The hemlock branches above weren't just touching. They were scraping aggressively against my roof rack with a high-pitched, metallic shriek. The collapsed cabin was no longer rotting wood. It looked intact, its dark window openings staring down at my truck like hollow eye sockets. And the green reflective road sign near the mailbox, which should have said Blackwood CR, RD, now bore fresh, painted white letters that read, Mercer Holler. Mercer was my mother's maiden name. Before I could process it, the static pop exploded through the speakers again. My ears popped violently. The odometer whirred backward another 0.4 miles, and in the blink of an eye, I was sitting back at the entrance of the valley by Highway 15 for the third time. Panic fully took hold. I put the truck in reverse, determined to back out onto Highway 15 and abandon the survey entirely. I threw my arm over the passenger seat and looked over my shoulder out the rear window to back up. My breath locked in my throat. There was no highway behind me. Where the open asphalt of Highway 15 had been 3 seconds ago, there was only a solid wall of dense, ancient hemlock trees and raw, black shale rock, rising 80 feet into the fog. The road behind me didn't exist anymore. The holler had closed its mouth. The only way was forward. I shifted back into drive, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold the gear lever. I pushed down the dirt track for the 4th time. On this pass, the holler felt suffocating. The air coming through the truck's climate vents smelled of wet river silt, stagnant water, and iron. The dirt track had narrowed to the point where the side mirrors were folding backward against the doors, pushed in by the encroaching mud banks. When utility pole number 12 appeared through the fog, I saw the rusted mailbox standing less than 6 inches from my driver's side window. The mail post was wrapped in thick, gray vine rot, and the rusty tin lid of the box was hanging open. Stuck inside the mailbox was a piece of yellowed, water-stained lined notebook paper pinned down by a flat creek stone. I brought the truck to a crawl and rolled my window down 2 inches. The air outside was freezing cold and dead silent. No wind, no birds, no sound of the creek. I reached out, grabbed the piece of paper from the mailbox, and pulled it into the cab. Unfolding it with cold fingers, my blood ran thick as ice. The note was written in black ballpoint pen. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was my own messy, jagged cursive, complete with the weirdly looped T's I've drawn since grade school. The note read, asterisk, do not look in the rearview mirror when the odometer rolls. It is not the road that is looping. It is the valley folding itself to bring you closer to the end. On the next loop, kill the headlights before pole 12 and do not stop until you feel asphalt. Asterisk. Beneath my text, at the very bottom of the page, was a line written in a different, rusty brown stain that had dried stiff. Asterisk, IT wants the miles back. Asterisk, a heavy, wet thud slammed onto the roof of my truck cab, like a 200-pound weight dropping straight out of the canopy onto the sheet metal above my head. The metal roof buckled downward an inch, right above my skull. I didn't wait for the loop to trigger. I slammed my foot onto the gas pedal. The Chevy roared forward through the mud. As utility pole number 12 flashed past my side window, I reached out and slapped the headlight dial, killing every beam of light on the truck. The holler went instantly, pitch black dark. I couldn't see the road. I couldn't see the mud banks or the trees. I kept my foot pinned to the floorboards, blind in the roaring darkness. Through the floor, I felt the truck hit the spatial anomaly. My ears didn't just pop. A deafening, high-pressure whistle shrieked through the cab. In the pitch blackness, the digital odometer on my dash began wildly counting down in reverse at terrifying speed, the green LED numbers flashing like a strobe light in the dark. Asterisk 114, 380, 114,300, 114,100, 113,000, asterisk. Outside the driver's window, in the absolute dark, something massive and wet dragged its weight along the side of the truck bed, screeching metal against metal, clawing for a hold as the vehicle was forced backward through space and time. I screamed, keeping my eyes locked straight ahead into the black windshield, holding the steering wheel deathly straight. Then came a violent, bone-shattering thud as the front suspension smashed into an incline. My head cracked against the driver's side pillar, and everything went black. When I woke up, the hot, blinding glare of late afternoon sun was pouring through my windshield. My truck was parked on the gravel shoulder of Highway 15, 3 miles south of the Blackwood Holler turnout. Engine idling, climate control blowing warm air. I sat up, groaning, wiping a trickle of warm blood from my hairline where I'd hit the pillar. I immediately looked down at my dashboard. The trip log was gone. My main odometer read 110, 112 miles. The vehicle had lost over 4,000 miles from its central computer in 3 seconds. When I got out to inspect the truck, the passenger side bodywork was deeply scored with long, parallel gouges, like thick, iron-tipped fingers had tried to drag the truck back into the earth as it tore free. I drove straight back to the county courthouse in Jackson. I walked into the clerk's office, handed over my field kit and my badge, and signed my resignation papers on the spot. I didn't give a reason, and nobody who lives in Breathitt County asked for one. I live in the flat, open farmland near Lexington now. I don't drive mountain roads, and I refuse to go anywhere where the trees block out the horizon. But every 6 months, when I take my truck in for a routine oil change, the mechanics always ask me the same question. They look at the diagnostic computer, look at my dash, and tell me they can't explain why my engine doesn't match the mileage on the clock. I never answer them, because I know that somewhere deep in Blackwood Holler, 4,000 miles of my life are still trapped in that dirt track, and something down in that dark valley is still driving them back to zero. My name is Vance Thorne. For 6 seasons, I worked as a lone fire watch observer for the U.S. Forest Service, stationed at the Big Frog Mountain Lookout Tower near the border where southeast Tennessee meets Georgia. At 4,200 feet, you are above the fog line for most of the autumn. On clear nights, you can look out across the Cherokee National Forest and see the faint, amber grid of Ducktown and McCaseville 30 miles away, glittering like fallen stars in the dark basin. Fire watching in a timber glass cab isn't like other jobs. It is endless hours of absolute stillness, broken only by the hum of the weather radio and the cold wind buffeting the glass. My main tool was an original 1930s Osborne Firefinder, a heavy, circular brass sighting table mounted on a steel pedestal in the center of the room. It has a rotating sight blade with a thin horsehair crosshair used to map exact azimuth coordinates when you spot smoke on distant ridges. It was late October during a severe drought. A cold, dry front had blown over the ridge, dropping the atmospheric humidity to 12%. It was 1:45 a.m. I was standing by the glass, taking my routine hourly horizon sweep with a pair of heavy 10 by 50 binoculars. Sweeping the glass from north to northeast, I noticed something wrong with the terrain. Where the distinct yellow glow of the valley town of Reliance should have been visible, there was only pitch-black void. It looked as though a massive, ink-black wall had been dropped straight out of the sky, shearing off the town lights in a perfect, flat line. Thinking it was a localized power grid failure, I stepped over to the Osborne firefinder. I lined up the rear sight, turned the heavy brass wheel, and centered the horsehair wire right where the dark edge met the night sky to log the azimuth bearing, 024 degrees. The moment the brass gear clicked into place on 024 degrees, a sharp, metallic hum echoed from the center of the pedestal, like a tuning fork struck against iron. I looked back out through the glass cab. The dark wall hadn't just stayed put. It had jumped forward. It was now 5 miles closer. Where the ridge line of Little Frog Mountain was supposed to sit 3 miles away, a colossal, jagged shadow of black stone and leafless trees now towered over the valley, completely blocking the moon. There were no lights behind it, no stars above it, and no sound coming from it. A cold knot formed in my chest. I turned the sight blade 10 degrees to the right to check if the movement was a strange optical reflection on the cab glass. Click! The brass gear locked at 034 degrees. Instantly, the entire mountain range shuddered. The steel support legs of my tower groaned under my boots. Outside, the pitch-black ridge took another massive leap forward, slamming into the basin less than 2 miles from my catwalk. I could see the edge of the shadow advancing across the forest below. It wasn't a shadow cast by light. It was a physical wave of dead, black stone that swallowed the forest as it moved. Wherever it passed, the tree canopy didn't collapse. It simply ceased to exist, erased into pitch-black void. Then the low-band Forest Service radio on my desk burst into frantic static. A voice came through, raspy, distorted, choked with heavy interference. It wasn't dispatch in Cleveland. It was a call sign I recognized from old station logbooks. Kimsey Mountain Lookout. Kimsey Mountain Tower had been dismantled and abandoned in 1974. Asterisk, Big Frog, do you copy? Asterisk, the voice crackled through the speaker. Asterisk, we're seeing a spatial shear on azimuth 030. There's a black ridge rising where the highway used to be. It's got a single glass cab lit up on the crest. Vance, it's your tower. Your tower is sitting on top of the ridge. Asterisk. My breath hitched. I grabbed my binoculars with cold, trembling hands and raised them to my eyes, aiming straight at the crest of the colossal black mountain that now towered just 800 yards from my catwalk. I focused the lenses through the gloom. Sitting on the apex of that impossible, pitch-black mountain was an exact duplicate of my own steel lookout cab. Its interior light was glowing warm yellow against the dark, and standing inside the glass, holding a pair of heavy binoculars pointed directly back at me, was a silhouette. I adjusted the focal wheel. The face came into crisp focus. It was me. Same canvas jacket, same pale face, same terrified posture. But on the duplicate side of the glass, the world behind him wasn't the Cherokee National Forest. It was a flat, white, endless void. As I watched, my duplicate raised his left hand and pressed his palm flat against the cab glass, his mouth open in a soundless scream. The realization hit me with brutal clarity. The ridge wasn't approaching my location. The ridge was replacing the world. Every time the brass firefinder moved, the anomaly folded the terrain, drawing my current reality closer to being overwritten. A violent clang rattled the steel frame beneath my feet. The corner leg of my tower buckled as the dark ridge slammed into the base of Big Frog Mountain. The glass windows in my cab fractured, sending long hairline cracks spiderwebbing across the panes. I dropped the binoculars, snatched my coat, and lunged for the cab door. I didn't bother using the brass table to turn the light off. I threw the hatch open and burst out onto the icy steel catwalk. The air outside smelled of pulverized slate and freezing ozone, cold enough to burn my lungs on every breath. I sprinted down the open-air wooden stairs, taking 3 steps at a time. Beneath me, 50 feet down, the ground was no longer the brown soil and pine needles of Tennessee. It was a sheer drop into pitch black, bottomless void that seemed to pull at my clothes as I ran. As I reached the lowest landing, the entire top cab of the tower collapsed inward with a deafening screech of tearing steel as the dark ridge swept over it. The warm yellow light died instantly. I didn't look back. I jumped the last 4 steps, landed hard in the dirt of the service road that remained on the southern slope, and ran blindly downhill into the dark. I ran 3 miles down the service trail until my boots hit the hard asphalt of Georgia State Route 2. I flagged down a passing timber transport at 4 in the morning, shivering, bleeding from my hands, and unable to speak. When Forest Service crews inspected the Big Frog site 2 days later, they found the steel legs of the lookout tower sheared off clean at the concrete footings, as if the upper 40 feet of the mountain had been sliced away by an industrial blade. The cab, the brass Osborne sight, and the crest of the peak were simply gone. I resigned from the Forest Service that week. I moved down to the coastal plains of South Georgia, where the land is flat for 50 miles in every direction. I live in a single-story brick home now, and I refuse to set foot on a ladder or look out a second-story window. People think I'm paranoid because I keep all my window blinds pulled tight to the sills. But they don't know what it's like to look at a distant horizon and wonder if the world you're looking at is still there, or if something else is stepping forward to take its place. My name is Jesse Cross. For 12 years, I worked as a heavy plant copper lineman for a rural telecommunications contractor in eastern West Virginia. If you've ever driven through Pocahontas County, you know it's home to the National Radio Quiet Zone, 13,000 square miles where cell towers, Wi-Fi routers, and radio transmitters are strictly illegal by federal law to protect the deep space radio telescopes at Green Bank. In the Quiet Zone, the air is dead quiet. Everything travels through old copper wire buried in cold mountain mud or strung across rotting hemlock poles. In the winter of 4 years ago, a brutal ice storm crippled the high elevation lines along Cheat Mountain. I was dispatched alone in a 4-wheel drive bucket truck to clear tree limbs and restore landline service to isolated homesteads off Route 28. It was 3:30 in the afternoon, but under the heavy leaden sky and thick snow canopy, it felt like midnight. 8 miles down an unpaved logging road, I found a severed trunk line hanging low across a gravel drainage ditch. It wasn't modern insulated cable. It was an uninsulated, double-strand copper line mounted on ceramic glass insulators, a legacy lead-sheath line installed by the coal companies in the 1950s and abandoned long before I was born. Out of habit, I racked my ladder against the pole, put on my leather gloves, and climbed up to check if the line had been grounded before clearing it. I pulled out my lineman's butt set, a heavy, rubberized test telephone with heavy alligator clips, and snapped the red and black leads onto the bare copper strands. I expected dead silence, or at most, the faint hum of ground loop static. Instead, the moment I pressed the receiver to my ear, I heard a crisp, crystal-clear dial tone. I froze. An abandoned 1950s wire carrying dial tone voltage 40 miles from the nearest central office was impossible. I flipped the monitor switch on my set to listen in on the line. The dial tone cut out, replaced by ambient background audio. It wasn't static. It was the distinct, unmistakable sound of a ceiling fan ticking on low speed, accompanied by the gentle clink of ceramic coffee mugs being stacked in a sink. Then, a low, familiar dog whine echoed through the earpiece, followed by the clatter of dog claws on hardwood floors. My throat went bone dry. It was the sound of my own golden retriever, Buster, pacing across our oak floorboards. And my house wasn't in Pocahontas County. My home was 90 miles west, in a suburban cul-de-sac in Charleston. I stood 30 feet up a frozen utility pole in the middle of a wilderness quiet zone, listening to my wife, Sarah, humming in our kitchen 90 miles away. I heard her set a kettle on the stove. I heard the distinct squeak of the third step on our staircase. Nausea hit me like a physical blow. I thought someone had somehow tapped my home landline into a regional routing frame. I leaned over my safety belt, grabbed my butt-set mic, and pressed the talk button. "Sarah?" I called out, my voice cracking. In the earpiece, the humming stopped instantly. The sound of footsteps approached the phone in my hallway. I heard the sharp, plastic click of my kitchen landline receiver being lifted. "Jesse?" Her voice came through the test set, sounding so close I felt her breath against my ear. "Where are you? Your boots are tracking wet mud all over the rug." I blinked, staring down at my boots. I was strapped to a wooden pole in a mountain snowstorm. But when I looked down at the base of the pole, my eyes couldn't process what I was seeing. The snow-covered gravel driveway beneath my truck was gone. In its place, stretching out around the base of the utility pole, was the dark patterned runner rug from my hallway in Charleston. The snow-draped pine trees surrounding the bucket truck were warping. Their thick, brown oak bark was peeling away and reshaping itself into the white-painted doorframes of my home. Pine needles were raining down through my living room ceiling, settling on my leather sofa. The physical world was contracting. The copper wire wasn't transmitting sound across 90 miles. It was physically reeling my home in Charleston into the mountain gap, drawing the two spaces together through the circuit. In my earpiece, Sarah's voice grew louder, laced with a strange, hollow echo. "Jesse, why is there snow coming out of the heating vents? Why are there branches in the closet?" I looked back down at the copper clips attached to the wire. The raw metal was glowing with a faint, violet luminescence, humming with a vibration so violent it rattled the teeth in my jaw. Where the wire stretched down the mountain trail, the forest canopy was literally zipping shut, the trees folding inward like the pages of a closing book, erasing the road behind my truck. Through the receiver, I heard heavy, wet footsteps coming from my basement stairs, footsteps that didn't belong to my wife or my dog. It sounded like iron spikes striking hardwood floorboards, dragging something heavy and wet behind them. "Jesse," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Something is standing in the kitchen with your coat on." A wave of pure terror surged through me. The physical line wasn't just pulling my house to the mountain. It was allowing whatever lived in that abandoned 1950s copper circuit to step out into my living room. I didn't unsnap the clips with my hands. I grabbed my heavy insulated wire snips from my pouch, hooked them over the lead strands, and squeezed with all my strength. The heavy copper wire severed with a loud, electric snap. A concussive shockwave of compressed air exploded from the wire, knocking my ladder off the pole and throwing me 10 feet down into the snowbank below. My head slammed against a rock, and the world spun in violent bursts of red and white. When I dragged myself up through the freezing slush, the spatial distortion was gone. The snow-covered mountain trail was back. My bucket truck was idling 20 feet away, its exhaust curling into the freezing air. The broken copper wire dangled uselessly from the insulator, dead and dark. I scrambled into my truck, turned the rig around in the narrow ditch, and drove 70 miles an hour down the frozen mountain trail until I reached a public payphone on the highway outside Elkins. My hands shook so badly I dropped 4 quarters into the coin slot before I dialed my home. Sarah answered on the second ring. Her voice was calm, normal, completely oblivious. She said she was making tea. She said the dog was sleeping by the radiator. She asked if I was coming home for dinner. I never went back to Pocahontas County. I quit the telecom contractor the following morning. I paid out of pocket to have our home landline permanently disconnected, and I cut every physical wire leading from the utility pole to my roof. We live in a modern apartment now, relying strictly on digital cellular networks. But in the winter, when heavy ice weighs down the outdoor cables, I still catch myself staring at the wall jacks in our hallway. Because I know that beneath the insulation and the plastic, millions of miles of old copper still snake through the dark earth of West Virginia, waiting for someone to clip in and listen to who's standing on the other end.